Hey, families. So I had not planned this, but I had a very simple question, and finding the answer kind of led me down the long and winding path that I now want to share with you. So it's gonna start with the harpedona harpedonaptae and go all the way to Nettie Stevens. Here we go. Um, so my question came up. Did Mendel know about the sex chromosomes? The reason this came up is because when I was taught Mendelian genetics, um, I was always taught sex-linked traits. So, for example, you've done a lot of crosses with your fruit flies, and for the most part, whichever parent has a particular trait, um, it doesn't really matter if the offspring are male or female, whether they have that trait or not. But there are a couple of exceptions. So, for example, if you breed a red-eyed female fly with a white-eyed male fly, the first generation of offspring will all have red eyes, but the second generation of offspring will be roughly 50-50 mix of the first two generations. So all of the females will have red eyes, but half of the males will have white eyes and half will have red eyes. On the other hand, if you have white-eyed females and red-eyed males as the parents, the first generation of offspring will have all red-eyed females and all white-eyed males. And the second generation will be kind of a mix of the two previous generations. So half of the females will have white eyes, half will have red eyes, and half of the males will have red eyes, and half of them will have white eyes. So it really does matter whether it's mom or dad who has the white eyes. That's a sex-linked trait. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would I think that Mendel wouldn't know about that? Is because plants are different from fruit flies. I mean, that's probably obvious when I say it, but here's what I mean. And I know that Mendel worked on other plants besides pea plants, although I think his focus was peas. I don't know if he worked on other organisms besides plants. Um, but again, he focused on peas, and if we look at a pea plant and zoom in, it does have males and females in that second, most of this plant is I believe it's the gametophyte stage. And the second generation is the sporophyte stage. So, in the flower, you've got the males with these anthers and they create pollen. You've also in the flower got the female, which is the stigma, that receives the pollen and the ovary where the peas are produced. Um, that's why he had to be so careful with his brushes, and he'd even like cover the flowers before and after pollinating so that bees couldn't get into the flowers and pollinate, spread the pollen from one plant to another and sort of mess up his very carefully planned crosses. So I'm not sure that Mendel could have known about sex-linked traits. So my question was, who did discover it? And it turns out it was someone I had never heard of before, and her name is Nettie Stevens. And she discovered the Y chromosome in 1905. Now, I will link this paper that she wrote in the description. You can read it for free, and I've read it all the way through. It's delightful. But very early on, she's talking about her methods, and she says, quote, "The cells are all small and could not be studied to advantage with less than 1,500 magnification." Unquote. And you can see a picture of Nettie. We're on a first name basis now. In here and her microscope. Now, to the best of my knowledge, microscopes like this back then and even now, you really can't find them with more than 1,000-fold magnification. So you're probably asking yourself, well, how did she get 50% more magnification going from 1,000 to 1,500? And that's what led me down this whole winding path. That starts with the harpedonaptae. I'm sorry, I looked up how to pronounce this. I'm still struggling. Um, these are the ancient Egyptian rope stretchers. So, just to remind you, this is our timeline of biology. Ever since we learned about Lyell, I like to kind of put all our discoveries in the context of time. And the history of biology starts with Aristotle in about 350 BC, so almost 2,400 years ago. So this is just to kind of make that a little more distinct. We have to compress the timeline of biology to this portion right here when we're talking about math, which, started long before this timeline starts. Just we're going to start our discussion of math with the ancient Egyptian rope stretchers. And we know they were doing their jobs at least around 3,150 BC. So more than 5,000 years ago. So, what is their relationship to math? Well, they would, among other things, stretch these ropes such that they would maintain their length. They wouldn't get longer or shorter. Um, and they would put these knots in the ropes at very regular intervals. So the distance between each knot was exactly the same. And they would put 13 knots, including on the ends of these ropes. Now, why 13? They knew that if you had a rope where you held taut at one end and then someone else held it 3 knots after that end, someone else held it taut 4 knots after that end, the remaining length of the rope would exactly equal five intervals of knots to the first person, and that this would create a right triangle. It's all they're able to um, accurately make 90 degrees, which help them survey land and parcel things out fairly to farmers, and probably helped with their amazing architecture, right? I mean, people wonder, how did these civilizations from thousands and thousands of years ago build things like the pyramids, just beautiful geometric shapes? And this was part of it. They didn't know why this 3, 4, 5 sided triangle gave you a 90-degree angle, but they knew that it always did. And they also knew that it didn't matter what the lengths between the knots were, um, as long as the lengths between each knot was the same on a given piece of rope, and you could create this 90-degree angles with this 3, 4, 5 triangle. So if you double the length between all of the knots, you would still get a 90-degree angle. And this scaling of the triangles is going to become important. So let's move ahead quite a bit of time to Thales, who is probably best known as the father of modern philosophy, at least of Western civilization. Um, and he lived around 585 BC. But in addition to saying that everything was water and trying to integrate, like get to the fundamental of what is similar between all things, he is famous for predicting an eclipse and for shadow reckoning. So Thales realized that, in a sense, you could make a triangle between your body and the angle of the light of the sun and the shadow you cast. And that in the same way that the harpedonaptae knew that as long as the lengths were the same, the angles of a triangle, as long as the lengths of a triangle sides were proportionate, like if you doubled one side, you doubled the other two, the angles would stay the same. Or if the angles were the same, you could scale up or down the lengths of the sides, and they would scale proportionately. So, let's say he's standing around in the, it's mid morning, right? Um, let's say he's 2 meters tall, right? That's pretty tall for back then, I think. But the angle of the sun is such that the length of his shadow is 1 meter. Um, he knew that if the length of the shadow of the pyramid was 100 meters, that the height of this pyramid was 200 meters. It scaled proportionately, 1 to 2 meters in his case, 100 to 200 in the case of the pyramid. So that was pretty clever because, nobody back then had a 200-meter ruler, for many, many reasons. So, Thales wasn't exactly contemporary of Pythagoras. They might have overlapped. I looked this up and I can't remember. But in any case, Pythagoras is pretty famous as a mathematician for coming up with um, the Pythagorean theorem. Um, I don't know that he proved this relationship, but he is credited for making this general relationship that the, you know, sort of ancient Egyptians kind of knew intuitively. And that is that the sum of the square of the two sides of a right triangle um, is always equal to the square of the hypotenuse side, the longest side. Um, so just kind of building on what both Thales and the ancient rope stretchers before him knew about triangles and their proportionality. Um, I think it was Euclid who was one of the first to prove the Pythagorean theorem. And what's interesting is that there have now quite a number of different ways of proving the Pythagorean theorem. Like I said, I think Euclid was the first in around 300 BC. So, about 230 years after Pythagoras. And what's so funny about this is that like it took me a long time to really understand what Euclid was doing with his proof. It's a very geometric proof. Um, and it's not the one that is most intuitive to me, which is funny because my partner loves all proofs of the Pythagorean theorem. He has a lot of love in his heart. I am very particular. So we are what you would call a mixed household, depending on which proof of the Pythagorean theorem you accept in your heart. Love is love, triangles. Anyway, um, so moving forward, Euclid was very influential in, and I think in his way accelerated the study of mathematics at this time in ancient Greece and Alexandria. Um, I don't know if Eratosthenes was directly a student of his, but about 50 years later, in about 250 BC, Eratosthenes was a librarian in Alexandria. And among other things, he used his knowledge of geometry and triangles to measure the earth. And the way I introduced Eratosthenes to Gracie was to say, there's a guy who figured out the size of the earth with a stick, um, which is just amazing. So what he did was he had a friend in Syene. I'm not even sure that's how you pronounce that ancient city, but this friend was very nice because Eratosthenes convinced him to, around midday, go down a well where the sun would be directly overhead. So when he looked up at from the bottom of the well, he could see the sun like fill the circle of the well. Um, and so his friend went down into this deep underground hole full of water. Um, at the same time that Eratosthenes was measuring the shadow the sun cast of a landmark in Alexandria. He knew the height of the landmark, so when he measured the um, the length of the shadow that it cast, um, when the sun was overhead, he could get the angle of the sun over Alexandria. At the same time, it was directly overhead Syene. So let's say that angle was 15 degrees. I don't even know that they used the Babylonian system of degrees at that time, but for simplicity's sake. Um, and let's say, the the full angle of a circle is 360 degrees. So 15 goes into 360 24 times. So if the distance from Alexandria to Syene is 500, you multiply that by 24. There's 24 of these little pizza slices to make up the whole circular Earth. Um, so 24 times 500 is about 1,200 miles, right? I'm just making this up. I don't know what the actual number is off the top of my head. But that's how Eratosthenes measured the earth with a stick, or, this landmark, essentially. I mean, he could have done shadow reckoning the same way that Thales did. So pretty cool that they knew in 240 BC the size of the earth. That's incredible. Okay, now, someone who was a contemporary of Eratosthenes was Archimedes, who's like one of our favorite historical characters ever. He's so awesome in so many ways. Um, but yeah, so he was around the same time, around 250 BC. He was born in I want to say like 287 BC, I think. Um, so Archimedes did a whole bunch, and I could go on and on singing his praises. But for the purposes of this discussion, he was the first to kind of prove the approximation of pi in a rigorous mathematical manner. And I just admire this because I would not have come up with this in 100 years. So I'm just so impressed by what Archimedes came up with. So he's trying to figure out pi, and he knew that pi was the constant um, that determined the relationship between circle's diameter, right? Like the line that goes through the center from one side to another. Um, so there was a relationship between a circle's diameter and its circumference that never changed, and that's pi, right? He's like, well, how do I calculate that? Well, I'm going to start with something like an equilateral triangle or an equilateral quadrilateral, which is a square. And if I draw it such that the corners of one square are tangent to the circle and the sides of a bigger square are tangent to the circle, I can calculate based on the radius of the circle. Um, the perimeter of this inner and outer square. And I know that the perimeter of the circle, the circumference, is somewhere in between. So I can bound um, the pi based on this. And it's not close. But then what I can do is use different polygons with more sides. That'll get me closer to the inner and outer bounds of pi, right? Like so a equilateral six-sided polygon, a hexagon on the inside and outside. Like that obviously looks like it's a little closer to the circumference of the circle. Um, so, you can calculate the perimeter of this square based on this is the radius and this is the diameter of the circle. You can now calculate, r is like I don't think he would have had the square root of 2, but he would have had something like that. So the inner perimeter is around 4r square root of times the square root of 2, and the outer perimeter is 4. So, pi is about 3.14, so between 2.83 and 4, right? That's not close, but pi is in there. And now as you increase the size of the polygon, the inner and outer polygon, you can get a little closer. I just think that's absolutely brilliant. I think he got up to like something ridiculous, like a 60-sided polygon. It was really impressive. Um, so again, let's just kind of show you how he did what he did, what I think is amazing. Um, so let's skip ahead 100 years to about 150 BC and Hipparchus, um, who is the father of trigonometry. Now, what he was trying to do was essentially use a kind of astrolabe to measure the angle between a celestial body and the horizon. Um, he was he knew that celestial bodies moved on an apparent sphere in the sky. So he was trying to get like the angular velocity of these celestial bodies moving through the sky. And he actually figured out that the moon's orbit isn't precisely circular. I mean, it's really close. So that's some precise calculations. So the reason he invented trigonometry was to help with those calculations. And what he did was say, like, I know that these celestial bodies are moving along this sphere in the sky, and I can't directly calculate what this chord this section of the circle that it's traveling along is, but I can calculate based on the angle and the celestial body here, the distance the triangle would be, like what the height is from the horizon, which I'm going to call sine, and thereby the distance from me, which I'm going to call cosine. So again, sine is like the height in the sky, cosine is the distance from me. Um, and he just, he made a big enough unit circle that he could easily calculate, okay, if this angle is 30 degrees, what is sine and cosine? And he just did that with using the Pythagorean theorem, which is really, really, he made these massive tables, and that was really, really impressive. So thank you, Hipparchus. Um, so now we're going to skip way ahead to Willibrord Snellius, and I am so sorry. I don't speak Dutch. I probably mispronounced that. But in about 1621, he was known as the Dutch Eratosthenes. So he did what Eratosthenes does, essentially measure the earth with a stick. He went to a number of different places in Europe, and I don't know if he discovered that the earth isn't exactly a sphere, that it kind of bulges near the equator, but he was, like I said, doing what Eratosthenes was doing, picking spots and using shadow reckoning to get the angular distance when he knew the traveling distance between these two spots to calculate the circumference of the Earth. Um, that was not all he did. Indeed, what he is most famous for is something that I don't think was well known uh, until posthumously, until after he died. Um, he had taken a lot of measurements of a beam of light um, before and during and after it entered a different medium. So, for example, he would, you know, put something like a straight stick at an angle into a glass of water. And as you know, when you do that, the stick looks bent, right? It's not the stick that's bending, it's the light. And he made measurement after measurement, and he realized that there was a relationship. Um, in that the relationship, the refractive index of a different medium, like the air and the water and the glass, um, was always equal to the sine of the initial angle that you, for instance, put the stick in water. And the angle, the sine of the angle at, that the stick appears to bend. Um, so I couldn't get direct evidence of like what media he tried. Um, but we since have quite a bit of knowledge of refractive indices. And so air is pretty close to really no apparent refraction, water, quite a bit of apparent react refraction, and oil, almost 50% refraction. And that, in fact, is how Nettie Stevens was able to increase her magnification almost 50%. She used oil immersion, so she had her slides where she had fixed her samples, and on top of that, she put probably mineral oil um, between the slide and her microscope um, eyepiece and her lenses and increased her magnification from 1,000 to 1,500, which still would have probably been an incredible eye strain. I mean, I'm just in awe of what she managed to do, even with what she knew about refraction and oil immersion. So let's spend some time admiring Nettie for a minute. So she dissected 5 different species of insects, and she was specifically looking at the cells within these insects that produced either sperm or eggs. And so imagine like the amount of optimization she'd have to do, right? Like each different species, you'd have to like figure out the best way to dissect these. And let me say, I have actually dissected fruit fly brains. It is brutal, right? Like because you have to have the fly under the microscope and these very fine, very tiny tools, right? So you're watching yourself dissect under the microscope and your hands are shaking even when you're not caffeinated because we can't ever be perfectly still and like trying to not mangle these tiny little brains. It's insane. Um, so she must have had the patience and steady hands of, I don't know, a statue. Um, so she had to do that for 5 different species, optimize the dissection technique and then how to fix them on the microscope slides. And then how to, she used different stains because at the time they knew that chromosomes were chemically different enough from proteins that you could stain both with different colors. But, you know, for each species, they stain a little differently, so you have to try different dyes, and even then, you're not always going to get clear resolution between the chromosomes and the rest of the cell. So yeah, she must have worked her butt off. So here's what she found. With the first species, the I think it's a kind of termite, um, she didn't really see that any of the chromosomes were of a different size, right? So I'm sure she was looking at hundreds of different cells in various, that were fixed to the slide in various states of division. But when a cell is getting ready to divide into two, um, they had known for a while that these chromosomes that stain with these special dyes um, will kind of line up and start migrating to opposite poles of the cell before the cell divides. Um, and there wasn't anything, like none of the chromosomes looked especially different from the other. So question mark on that. So she moved on to a different species, Cinopelmatus. I don't know. Um, and she noticed that there was one chromosome that seemed to migrate a little bit differently. And so when the cell split in two, it hasn't yet made sperm cells, like half of the cells would have this weirdo chromosome and the other half would have a full complement of totally normal chromosomes. Both would have the same number of these dots, although that's hard to see, right? Because imagine the cells is like roughly spherical shaped, right? And if you've got 2 chromosomes that are same size, but you've managed to fix the cell at a wonky angle, it might look like that, right? So obviously this chromosome looks bigger than this one, even though they're actually the same size. So it's not easy to figure out. And again, she's working with like a regular light microscope. So these still were probably impossibly tiny. And she had to hand draw each one of these figures, and there were over 200. I mean, what a laborious task. But she did find that one of the, I think in this case it was like 23 chromosomes, or maybe this one was 20, um, was different, and that half the sperm cells had it and half did not. So she moved on to um, Blatella Germanica. Um, and again, she saw there was always this one weirdo chromosome, and it would always be found in 50% of these protosperm cells. It was in this Tenebrio molitor species that she really found pay dirt. Um, so she found that again there was this one small chromosome that was always kind of hanging around this normal size chromosome. Um, and these cells would undergo this division. Like when you see the chromosomes lining up, about to migrate to opposite poles of the cell before the cell divides, um, the pairs of chromosomes look pretty similar. And that makes sense, right? Excuse me. You will have a number of different chromosomes. For example, we have 23 pairs, right? Where do they come from? Each of those pairs, one comes from mom, one comes from dad, right? You'd expect they'd look pretty similar, right? Because maybe the one from mom came from grandma, or maybe it come from grandpa. So they have to have kind of the same stuff, right? Except this one weirdo, right? Like that does not look the same size as its pair. Um, and so it would migrate and divide. And it turns out that each of these chromosomes on either side of the equator here is actually a double, right? It's actually already being duplicated, and it's about to split off, so that sperm and egg cells will actually only have half the normal complement of chromosomes, which makes sense, right? You get half of your chromosomes from your mom, half from your dad. If you got 46 chromosomes from each, you'd end up with 92, and you wouldn't make it very far in terms of development. Um, so mom and dad's cells have to like split their chromosomes in half and give you, some from grandpa, some from grandma, but only half of the total complement, so you can get the other half from your other parent. Um, that is the very brief discussion of meiosis. So meiosis one is where you've got your chromosomes, one each from mom, one each from dad. You duplicate them. They just look like one thing, but they line up and they split apart for meiosis one. Now both of these cells have, um, you know, uh, how to say this, um, either chromosome one from mom or chromosome one from dad, but not one of each, right? And then in meiosis two, they split. So now instead of having pairs of chromosomes, you only have um, one of each. Um, and that's how you make sperm and egg. So yeah, I mean these pictures are incredibly clear, and that was the real clincher. Um, and she also noticed that with females, you never saw this weirdo chromosome. They all looked like normal size, but 50% of the sperm would have this weirdo chromosome. So yeah, that was pretty incredible. And so that was the first time we knew that gender was determined by the males, that sperm would either have a Y or an X chromosome. Eggs would always have only X chromosomes. So it's dad who determines whether you get an X or a Y. Um, Mom is guaranteed to give you an X. Um, she looked at this final fifth species, kind of aphid, and again, saw this. So that's incredible, right? She knew that different species had different numbers of chromosomes. We have 23 pairs. I think the Steno has 20 pairs. Um, I think another one of these has 23, and I honestly can't remember which one. Um, and she also knew that each of the chromosome pairs would be different sizes. So, for example, in the termite, right, all of them were roughly the same size. There is an Y chromosome, but it's not all that much different from the X chromosome, at least as far as she could tell. Um, but they're distinctly different Y and X chromosome sizes in the T molitor. So that's amazing. Thank you, Nettie. Um, so yeah, an incredible discovery. I just wanted to know how we figured out about sex-determined traits, and Nettie was the one who discovered it with a little help from the ancient Egyptian rope makers and Thales and Pythagoras and Euclid and Archimedes and Eratosthenes and Hipparchus and Snell. So thank you for indulging me.